walking his dog and taking care of some things. So let me put him in.
Cool. Did you get my email today from my work email on the chaos continuum?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that we appreciate it because Andrew was like, "Hey, man, did you ever call or talk to Aaron about maybe sending it over?" Because we talked that night. We were on the phone until like midnight, and I was looking at the article and everything else. And he was like, "Did you call him about getting that one?" I was like, "Nah, that's my fault, man. I totally dropped it. I meant to ask you, and I just forgot about it because it was midnight, and so we haven't got the chance to read it yet, but we have it. So
cool, good. No, I just want to make sure it went through. I don't even think I had to get on British Journal to even pull it up. I think it's a free PDF on.
Yeah, I don't know. We searched chaos. It was like the controlled chaos or something like that, and we're like, we'll just have to call them and see which one it was.
Yeah,
because we couldn't figure it out. So
it's specific to, like I said, it's specific to, I believe, soccer, but the underlying theme of going from a controlled setting and then introducing the multiple parameters, multifaceted, essentially the chaos of sport, but in an incremental fashion to post rehab, essentially.
Oh yeah, I mean they call it controlled chaos. We call it motor control. I mean there's a million different things, right? So
yeah.
Looking at motor control theory, I mean that's part of it is go from where it's controlled, and they start with basic skills, and then they learn and they start, okay, well we're going to throw something at you or make this unstable, or put you in a group about whatever, or take you out on the field and see if you can react to it and that kind of stuff. So that is it basic. I mean, I'll read it, and if it's the same thing, then I'll just tell you, hey, I think it's the same thing.
Yeah.
And if it's any different, that'd be good to read too. So love to see it. Dwayne, how are you, man?
Doing pretty good. How about yourself?
I'm rushing in, man. We literally just had some freaking Fresh Market pizza, ran in and trying to take care of it, man. But this Aaron was funny, so I've been telling Aaron, I'm like, hey, man, let's hold off until this Josh guy can kind of come in on the call and potentially. And he was just like, oh man, we got to talk about it soon. And I was like, well, Josh is in LA. I tried to call him. He's not. He's at a course, but we might as well go ahead and talk it and at least talk generalities, and then
For sure.
just, even if we record it or if we don't, I don't really care. I think it's just an interesting topic to hash out and kind of challenge our own views and just kind of see where we're at.
Me and Dwayne have learned very quickly to just record everything, because you never know when you're going to say that gold nugget that's like, oh man, wish I could have snapped that out. So
that's true. Touche.
Yeah. So real quick story. Amy came home from one of her classes today. She's got exercise prescription in her teacher there was talking about explaining to the class how they were going over strength training real quick, and mind you, what she told me was this is like the only thing that they're going to get on strength training and understanding its principles. And all they did, I mean, they're talking to like a doctorate level class, so I was expecting at least some like deep terminology, if anything. But she was just like, yeah, we were real confused today in class. The teacher was essentially, she was talking about how you get true strength, and the only way you get true strength is by hitting rep max sets for your clients. And I was like, well, first of all, what does true strength mean? Second of all, like maxing out on your sets every time, and she's like, yeah, and that's the thing. We were like, we asked a whole bunch of questions. It's like, what do you mean you can only get stronger by max sense? Like, what about submaximal loads and accumulating volume? Because half the class was like, into lifting weights, and the teacher
exercise science based too, and they were like,
yeah,
this doesn't
like,
sound
what are you talking about? And the teacher was like hell bent on defending the stance, like you need to lift maximal loads, and how submax loading isn't true strength development. And everyone was like so confused by the statement, and so she asked me, she's like, you're telling me about the whole, you got to add more work in order to to get stronger, and the way you do that is by backing off the intensity. And so I say that because the teacher was like, yeah, the biggest contributor to strength development is hypertrophy. And I was like, bingo, Amy, she's contradicting herself. The whole reason you back off intensity is to accumulate more load to develop more hypertrophy to get stronger. And anyway, she was just super frustrated because half the class was just like staring at each other like, what?
Well, and I think
we lift weights like we're not all going in there hitting 5-rep maxes every time.
And that's where you have to feel bad as a physical therapist for our profession, because the reality is we don't all have to be exercise science backgrounds. Mm-hmm. And that actually, to me, when I came into it, and Andrew, I don't remember if Andrew was exercise science or not. I think he was. But we had a girl in our class that was a history major, another that was a psychology major, maybe a couple that were psych majors, and which is great. But the requirement for them was not an exercise prescription class. It wasn't anything, even just the basics. So when we had a crash course in school, it definitely didn't do us justice. And so we're turning around on the back end and saying, let's get people more active, and we're movement experts. But then when we get to, we say that, and Josh is funny. He gets pissed when people say we're movement experts, because he's just like, we don't even know what the hell we're doing half the time. Half of you don't even know what you're doing. And it's because of this scenario is where, I see Andrew.
It was just funny because we just talked last week about, how the relationship of inappropriate loads and constant RPE 10 grinder sessions, and their like almost verbatim correlation to injuries. And it's like, how are you going to tell your physical therapy students something that's going to lead to injury? Just max sets, every time.
I know. What I love, though, is the fact that the class did ask, and the class did look at each other and say, like, this is crazy. Because the one good thing about the internet, the internet's freaking old, but I'm talking about information being out there more prevalent. So the prehab guys started about 3 years ago, back when I was in school, still 3 or 4 years ago. And once they started, you saw Barbell Physio start, Zach Long, and a couple other guys really start pushing out more content. And now physical therapy students have more resources to be more aware. So when the biased professor says, oh, well, it's this, and this, it's no, like, we have a different perspective. It doesn't mean that everything that a professor says is wrong. I mean, I don't agree with that statement for sure. But I think, there are inherent biases, and Andrew could speak to this. We had a professor that was, a couple that had their biases towards certain things. But I think it was always nice because if you had a deeper understanding, or at least had somewhat of a background in exercise science or something, you could say, we can agree to disagree on this point. Tell me what you think. I'll listen to what you say, but we can agree to disagree on something. So I'm just glad that the information is out there, because that's terrible. Is this the story you said would piss me off?
Yeah, it was just so, like you said. I mean, there's things where you can like flirt with and agree to disagree on, but when it's like so blatant, like if you've just spent a couple months in a gym, like half the students in there, you'd obviously know like what are you even trying to say right now?
and that's luckily, physical therapists for the most part are a very health conscious and health directed, population, and they want to be healthy. And so we're a little bit more aware of that kind of stuff, and tend to pursue those exercise science degrees, or at least have an interest in exercise for the most part, especially those who would be in the fitness setting eventually anyways. But then it comes down to, it doesn't matter if it's fitness setting or not. If you're working with the patient who just had a stroke, you still need to understand exercise intensity and prescription just the same as you do someone in the orthopedic setting. Just because they're not lifting weights doesn't mean that they're not doing strength training, right? And that's, I think, where we have to get a little bit smarter. And it needs to be a part of our programs. And quite frankly, Andrew can speak to this. We didn't have a lot of it. I mean, we had just a little bit of it. Is that Andrew chewing chips or something? I hear somebody chewing something.
Yeah, that's what.
Am I not muted?
That's where Amy's frustration came in, was she said like, half the class was like this is dumb. But the other half of the class with no experience, like that was the only dabble of, hey, this is how you strength train they're going to get. And so like that's it for them. That's the information they have on it.
I think that's what I got from the story. And, the three of us, we come together, and I think the one thing that we all share is that, and it's a little bit strange, we all may be kind of mavericks in our respective field, in that, we don't necessarily just go with the grain. And that was Aaron, that was one of our early conversations where you yourself told me to question everything that you told me. That's my nature anyway, to just be an inquisitive person, just to want to pursue the knowledge for myself regardless. But we all know, and it happens in every profession, but I find it particularly troubling to see it in the medical profession, to where we tend to fall into what I call groupthink, and it's like everybody believes this and nobody ever questions it. So nobody ever questions it. You know what I mean? And then, and ultimately, and this is something that Ray and I talk a lot about, that ultimately that just hurts the client. It hurts the patient, because we all believe this. No one has ever questioned it. So no one actually has the research behind it. And that can be good or bad, but in this case, where, Aaron, you bring up a situation where this is probably not the best information for us to all just accept verbatim without doing our own research, but just like what Ray said, for the students that had no exercise science background, that piece of questionable information kind of becomes gospel to them right now.
Right, that's what they got, right.
So that's the only challenge that I have, or the issue that I see with that type of stuff, because just like what we were saying earlier, with the internet and with all the overwhelming sources of information that are always being thrown at us, it's hard to research everything. At some point you just have to kind of go with your gut and say, this doesn't really jive with what I think. Let me go look that up for myself. But we can't possibly research everything,
Right.
Well, and that's exactly right, is we can't. And that's why I think our reliance on it all the time can be faulty. But I think if you have some there and you can fall back on it, great. Does it mean it's the only thing? Not necessarily, but I think that it goes to, well, you're right. All they go off of in school, and then we'll move on to mobility, but all they because we could go on this all day, but all they go off in school is, what they're taught. So they're learning research. She's in her first year, right? Yeah. And they're learning like research and how to critically analyze research, and what do certain things mean, and how to basically decipher the research for themselves. And then they'll be really research-based really early on before they get a lot of clinical experience, and then they start to form their own opinions. But early on, that's what they go off of. They go off of expert opinion that they deem as being their professors, and then if they search for the literature, then they may find some things, and hopefully they'll come across some other things like, session RPE and RP in general, and hopefully find those things now, which I learned is being taught actually at the undergrad level, at least at CSU. I had a student, and she was like, "Oh, RPE for strength training, yeah, it's this." I was like, man, I'm so glad, because 6, I guess it was 7 years ago when I took the class, I didn't get that. It was % 1 rep max, and now they've shifted, which is great, because now the students coming in are a little bit smarter as far as strength conditioning goes, but still got a ways to go, especially in the PT world. I don't disagree. So, well, and that kind of brings us to mobility. So I'm going to kind of sit back and somebody wrote it on the section. Was it you, Dwayne? So right, yeah. I just want to know what your question was, and then I'm just going to jump in whenever. But I just kind of want to know what your questions were, what your thoughts are, and then obviously Aaron and I and Andrew and you can everybody can feel free to chime in. But let's just kind of hash this one out, because this one will be fun.
Sure.
Right. Well, the basic premise was just mobility in general. I know that we can take this from several different angles. So just looking at the big picture mobility, and looking at that from a couple different perspectives. So I specifically wanted to look at the types of programs that that specifically target mobility, as in, i.e., you need to work on mobility separate from whatever else you're working on. Like, this is a totally separate discipline, and you need to focus on this in order to be better at whatever it is you're working on. So I wanna address that question. I also want to address mobility as an excuse for performance. So and also that ties into basic lifestyle type things, as far as from our respective positions, has possibly sedentary lifestyles, or less activity because of spending more time at work, or stress related stuff, has that become a factor in mobility as it affects other areas of physical activity?
So I'm just going to see if I can get you to elaborate on this point. The mobility as an excuse for performance. Did you have a particular example in mind where this thought came up, or I guess?
Well, yeah, for my own, this actually comes from my own background. A couple years ago, I got into Olympic lifting, and because those movements were so new to me, and I had trouble getting into some of the positions properly, I kind of like, and I'll just go there as far as myself. I could never achieve a proper front rack, never. Not until I spent some time actually trying to perfect some of my Olympic lifts, and I found out, wow, I can achieve a front rack. I just, had it not been for that, I would have possibly spent the rest of my life thinking that I just can't achieve a front rack. Like, I just don't have the mobility, or the structure, or whatever it is, that I just cannot get my body properly in that position. And had it not been for the fact that I was doing the Olympic lifts, that I took the time to actually think about what I needed to do to warm up properly. And honestly, for a little while, I did consider doing some specific mobility based workouts, i.e. gymnastic stuff and just specific mobility stuff, with the thought that those movement patterns would automatically shift over to my Olympic lifting. That was the assumption. And I won't jump to the end on how I feel about that stuff now, but those are the types of things that I want to discuss over the course of this discussion.
So more like mobility specificity. Like, I mean, you kind of went and you were like, well, let me try a couple other things as far as warm up goes. I think I hear you. I think I'm just writing stuff down. I'm trying to make sure that I'm on the right path with you. So I'm just kind of gathering some thoughts. Do you have any thoughts on those? So your questions, just in recap, were types of programs that target mobility, and we can get that's a big topic. We can get into that. Mobility as an excuse for poor performance, more or less. I guess people kind of getting caught up in that as well, right? So those are kind of the two main things.
Right.
Okay. Just making sure I have it written down, so if we don't touch on something, we can steer it that way.
Absolutely. And we've kind of talked about one of those before. The I don't know if it was in the psychosocial conversation, but just the fact that for me, and I see it in the gym every day, people who have, for whatever reason, adopted the thought that I can't achieve the front rack, so I'm gonna use one of the alternative movements, and I'm just gonna stop trying to achieve the front rack because I know that I can't do it. And I know that the three of us, we've already discussed that in terms of how those types of thoughts limit our performance instead of empowering us to want to improve. And so that's probably a good place to jump in, since we've already kind of touched on that a little bit.
Aaron, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So from my experience, my point of view, where I'm coming from, just to kind of lay the foundation in terms of my goggles on mobility, is mobility is another aspect of training, no more, no less. There's strength, there's conditioning, there's mobility. It's just another facet of training, and it falls within the same parameters and honestly the same um, uh, filters that it needs to go through, just as strength and conditioning does. So what I mean by that is I don't see them in a hierarchy, which a lot of training methodologies and a lot of other people's goggles view it as. You've got to get mobile, and then you can prioritize strength, and then you can prioritize conditioning. And I don't see it in this hierarchical way. I see it as a level playing field, and it's constantly either battling or focusing in on your specific needs. So what I mean by that is strength is specific to what we do, conditioning is specific to what we do. The mobility that you need is specific to what you do.
Yeah.
Strength takes time to develop, conditioning takes time to develop, mobility takes time to develop. Strength is a structural adaptation, conditioning has structural adaptations to it, mobility has structural adaptations to it. These adaptations come from consistency, training, and progression across the playing field with mobility, strength, and conditioning, right? I'm sure I'd love to know, Ray's, not your thoughts, but actually explain to me a little bit more on the science behind actual structural changes for the tissues there. That would be one of my side questions. But with this kind of understanding of taking away from this hierarchy structure and more of a level playing field, that's where my goggles are set. So
Okay.
if somebody has a mobility issue, I'm not stopping them from lifting. I'm not stopping them from their conditioning. Right, we're working on the mobility. If there's some what I call manipulations, right, quick manipulations that we can do that cause a temporary improvement in their mobility, so that we can train that range of motion, then by all means, let's do it. But the priority, what cements in that mobility permanently, is just what is needed for strength and conditioning: a load, a progression, and a stressor, right? We have to structurally change that biology there. So we can work on these all together at the same time. And if we constantly work passive mobility, mobility without loading, we're never going to get the final result, right? We've got to create a progression there. So with that, the specificity side, perfect example right now, I'm about 2 weeks out from my powerlifting meet. And if you took a snapshot of me, you would say, hey, you've lost some mobility. And my corrected statement for you would be, my mobility has gotten specific. My tendons, my ligaments, my structures, my musculature, the tension there is very specific to these ranges of motions that I have, which is really good, right? I don't want a whole lot of elasticity at these extreme ranges of motion, because that's going to hinder my strength development, my transfer of energy, et cetera, et cetera. With that being said, if I were to try and get into my overhead squat right now, it's going to be tough. Right.
Yeah.
What I'm going to do to improve that isn't a whole bunch of passive modalities. I'm going to get that barbell and I'm going to stretch into that position. And guess what? I'm going to be uncomfortable. It's going to feel bad. It's not going to feel good. I'm going to be appropriate with it. I'm not going to be aggressive with it. Once this meet's done, I have full intentions of going into the Olympic lifts for a new training parameter. But I think we can all agree that the Olympic lifts have the extreme ranges of motion needed, and it's going to take some time. And I'm not going to do any sort of ROM-WOD program or whatever fancy things out there. I'm just going to work on these larger ranges of motion, get some loading going, take my time, create a progression with it, and then not only progress load, but then progress exercises. Start with the power variations, then go into full overhead squats or front racks or whatever. There's going to be a titration somewhere. So it's never, from my viewpoint, a hierarchy standpoint. It's the level playing field, and we've got to address the areas where we need to and when we need to.
Gotcha. Hey, well, I guess first, did you have any questions on what he said, Dwayne? I don't know if you did. I think you guys have probably talked about this before.
Yeah, we've talked about this, so I'm pretty much on the same page with everything that he said.
Yeah. Andrew, I know Andrew texted me, was like, hey, I just want to chime in, whatever, but he is, I think he may still be outside. Are you still outside, man?
I am, and the wind's kind of rough, so
that's fine.
So I didn't want to chip in yet.
No, you're good.
The only thing I was going to add is knowing your purpose too, and I think that's a lot of what Aaron was just talking about. Is do we need that range of motion? How many of us need to do Olympic lifts? And here comes the wind. Sorry if that's loud. But how many of us need that range of motion? And are we building it to work towards something, or are we trying to compensate for injuries or lack of range of motion? So when you were talking a little bit about people trying to shy away and just saying, well, I'll never do a front rack or I'll never do an overhead squat. Is that okay? Like, how many of us need to do a front rack and how many of us need to do an overhead squat? And so it's going to be patient dependent, your program. And I think that's a little bit what y'all hit on. So I'll sit back and kind of let the discussion go where it goes, and I'll be able to participate a little bit more in like 5 minutes.
I hear you. Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a good point, because I think, Aaron, you said the same thing. It's specificity, right? And it goes back to our previous conversation of asking the question, so what? And if the answer is, I want to be able to lift and do everything like all the other people in this class are doing, and I want to be able to participate in this class, so I want to be able to get into a front rack position, great, all right, let's work on it. Let's not shy away from it. And that's when I may say, hey, like, and I would agree with your statement as far as mobility goes, like, okay, if you can't get into a front rack position, say they just have, whether it's capsular hypomobility or whatever, and they can't get into a little bit of external rotation to get there, maybe you do a mobility or mobilization specific to that, and then follow it up with a front rack position and follow it up with load. I think it's specificity. So on the topic of mobility, one thing I wanted to bring up is I think a lot of times we get tricked into thinking it's truly just a mobility issue. And so we're like, okay, when he goes into a squat, he's having some pinching in the front of his hip. It's just a mobility issue. And so we just need to mobilize it. And sometimes in a lot of joints, you'll actually get that actually creates an issue, or they don't necessarily need the mobility, but they need the motor control. And whether you accomplish that through mobilizations with some target specific exercises, or maybe you go and you're like, no, let's just take this a little bit slower. Let's back off on the load. Let's keep you going. Aaron, you alluded to that in the last call, where it's like you're giving them tactile feedback, and it's like, all right, right here, flatten here, do this. And you're giving feedback to feed into motor control. And so I think we have to make sure that we understand, and that the listeners understand, that they're not necessarily two separate, they're not necessarily the same thing, but I think a lot of times are viewed as the same thing. If someone comes in, and Aaron, I kind of sent this over to you, if we have questions, then we can talk about it. But if someone comes in and they've got pinching in the front of their hip, and I go through my examination and I say, you know what, they actually present with some signs and symptoms consistent with basically an anterior femoral glide syndrome. And in that case, they've got basically overuse of TFL or hamstring, whichever school of thought you go into. And it's basically a motor control issue that's causing it to make it look like there's a mobility issue, or that same exact syndrome could be a mobility issue causing a motor control issue. I think the reality is we have to understand that there's the mobility issue can go a whole bunch of different ways. So we're talking motor control, which those are the patients where they may do really well with not needing mobilizations and just titrating the load and backing off and going through it and being smart about it. And I agree with your statement, Dwayne, where we don't need to let these people be fearful. If they want to do it, hey, let's figure it out. Like, look, you're really young. That's great. Your joints are going to respond really well to this. I want you to just try and get into that position. If it's super uncomfortable at first, or if it's uncomfortable at first, it's because your body's not used to it. Let's not go crazy on the load. If it becomes painful, then maybe I need to have somebody take a look and say, okay, are they physically able to get into that position? And I think that's when, and that is sports specific too. When I work with golfers and tennis players, not every single tennis serve looks the exact same. Not every golf swing, especially as they age or have limitations in certain joints, look the same. Some have to toe out. Some have to change what they're doing in order to accomplish the task most efficiently. And I think that goes into weightlifting as well. Nobody fits into a perfect box and has the same squat form or the same deadlift form because we're all different. If I come in and patient A has, the really severely anteverted hips, or saying basically they're toed out there, basically their hips want to be here, and we try and force them here and they start pinching, well, you have to understand anatomy. And you have to understand that maybe they need to be out here, right? And that's where I think we throw out mobility and we throw out all these different things and say, let's work on, like you said, a ROMWOD, and let's just give everybody this really specific or this really general program for mobility because that's what we need. No, you know what? It's a moving target, and that's just what it is. And Aaron, I know I sent you this podcast, but I thought that I don't agree with everything Kelly Starrett says, but I love the term of it's a moving target. Like, it needs to be specific to that day. If I'm coming in and I start on my squats and I get a little bit of pinching in the left hip, which I do, and I already know that, hey, what's up, man? And I already know that Aaron's managing my load. I know how to monitor RPE. I know that he's loading me appropriately. So it may not be the load so much, and it may not be potentially the fatigue, but it's like, dang, I need to go over here and I'll do some TFL down regulation real quick, come back over to the barbell and start loading again. And then all of a sudden it's like, I'm not getting pinching in my hip. Was it a mobility issue? No, it's a motor control issue. It's a moving target. And I think if we try and just treat it like it's this general, everyone needs to do this mobility class, I think, is it harmful? I don't think so. Is it exactly correct? Not necessarily, right? I think teaching people how to do these things, so if it does come up and they do actually need to do it, is fine. But I'm with you, Aaron, on the side of, look, you have to be specific about it. If you're going into a squat and you've got excessive forward trunk lean and your anatomy is not supposed to do that for this individual, and now they're having back pain, and you look and they're all up on their toes, or they can't hardly clear their toes, so they just flex all the way forward, then okay, let's check out your ankle range of motion. Put them on the table. See what it looks like. They should have at least 10 degrees of dorsiflexion to get into that squat, depending on what type of squat you want to do, right, or deadlift or whatever. Let's make sure they got it. And if they don't, do a quick mobilization real quick or some whatever. I say mobilization to the joint, and then go and then follow it up with load. I 100% agree with you. If we just mobilize and stretch and then do nothing about it, and don't take advantage of those short-term physiological effects, we're wasting our time. And that's kind of my statement on it. If you don't follow it up, and I do this in physical therapy, if they're coming in and their hamstrings are tight, we may do some autogenic or reciprocal inhibition techniques, and then we're going to freaking load it right after that to tell the body, hey, now that you have this mobility, here's what you need to be able to do with it, especially the weightlifters. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, man, my back doesn't bother me. It's like, well, you have to go through this routine. So their hamstring routine is specific, and they go into their deadlifts right after, or maybe instead of doing a barbell deadlift in front, they do a trap bar to get a little bit less hamstring.
Don't forget either that working on the specific drill or mobility can be the mobilization exercise you need anyways.
Bingo.
So if you're working on deadlifts and you're complaining and you're telling your client over and over, hey, keep that back flat, it might be that their hamstrings are just so damn tight they can't actually anteriorly pelvic tilt. And so working on that mobility and working on that drill can be the mobility exercise and working on those eccentric loads. So I think sometimes we overthink it, and I agree that it's not one thing less or more than another, but I think sometimes we try to separate it all too much, and we forget that the body and the nervous system is going to respond appropriately to a lot of different stimuli. So
yeah, it was you. Hey,
there's my god kid.
Could you guys, I just cut out, so
Yep.
basically I just went on a rant because I think this is Kylie. This is my daughter, by the way. Say hello. All right. We got to make cookies in a couple minutes. We're almost done, okay? All right, go close the door. Close the door. Close it. Say bye. Bye. All right, thanks. But all the way.
It's like that news reporter and his kids run in.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think we need to do a better job equipping the coaches with how to understand what's the difference between mobility and motor control, and when is motor control actually causing a mobility issue. And I think we as physical therapists sometimes say, well, why would we teach that? That's our stuff, right? We need to do this or whatever. But we're talking injury prevention, and I think it's well within your scope of practice to be able to do quick assessment. We can all look at somebody and say, if they can't lift a barbell or lift something overhead, hey, something looks wrong here. And giving you at least a small tool to be able to differentiate. And then if it's like, I tried this, they're having pain or whatever, hey, Ray, take a look at him. Hey, Andrew, take a look at him. I don't see a problem with it, but I've talked long enough.
I think one more thing to add on to the piece of the generalized statements there is taking the strength coach into consideration in terms of the fundamentals. I mean, I always say it a lot is the fundamentals are overlooked because people think that they're basics, and fundamentals do not mean basics, nor does it mean simple. The fundamentals are extremely complex. How we display the fundamentals should be simple to the client. So with that statement, we talk about, is it mobility? Is it motor control? Is there something going on? Well, the fundamental is, and I say this from experience because I can't tell you how many times somebody has swore to everything holy that they've been coached, they've been doing this for years, they know this, that, and the other, and I see them do their movement. I'm like, well, you're not even doing the movement right. Like, we're not talking about mobility. We're not talking about anything special. You're not even squatting appropriately.
Yeah.
And I think the huge issue there is the strength and conditioning world has spread themselves so thin. The strength coach thinks he's a jack of all trades. Oh, I'm a hockey coach. I'm a football coach. I'm a speed coach. I'm this, that, the other. And then when it comes time to squat, they just say, hey, 3 sets of 5 squat. Cool. Your hips and your knees flexed and you stood up. Awesome. There's your squat. And I mean, I have spent over a decade, 10,000 plus hours on 3 movements. Granted, obviously I've done a few more things than that, but it's a continually refined process over these movements. And again, just because it's fundamental, I think we just assume, check the block. Hey, we assume they're squatting right, so let's go to something else. Well, whoa, who says they're squatting right? You? Yeah. Let's check this out, because if I can be cynical for a minute, 90% of people out there that are personal trainers and strength coaches, I truly would be concerned with their qualification to actually 100% fundamentally break down a movement like the squat or the overhead press, or to know how to make the adjustments. So a lot of times, I think me and Dwayne talked about this. It's mobilization has gotten a bad taste with me, because in my experience, it's been the cop-out answer. Oh hey man, I couldn't teach you to squat in 10 minutes, so mobility issue, write you off. Here's your list of exercises. I mean, I can't tell you how many clients, people are blown away when I have an introductory course with a client and we spend 45 minutes on a squat. They're like, what do you do? I was like, well, it's called teaching. You don't learn math in a day. You don't learn. Yeah. So I think it's really important to have that said, that before assuming mobility or any complex issues, like let's make sure the fundamental is actually established, or at least has been hell-bent tried to establish.
100% agree. I'll give one example, and then I'm going to sit back for most of the rest of the call. I had a client come to me who hurt her back doing a deadlift. And so I was like, well, let me take a look. The pain was so irritable that I wasn't like, hey, well, just show me how you do it. Because as soon as she flexed forward, she's like, no, can't do it. And so it was a matter of getting tissues to calm down. But on the third session, I said, show me your deadlift. And first we talked load management. This was someone who for a 5x5 was doing way too much in the first place and didn't understand, oh, I'm supposed to have like a number in mind. Like I'm not supposed to just throw weight on here, and it is what it is. We can
that goes back to fundamentals, People
it's fundamentals, load management. But then also it was like, let me see your deadlift. Mm-hmm. Like, show me what you're talking about. And in physical therapy, we do that a lot where it's like, man, when I get down in the garden, like my neck's really hurting me. I'm like, well, show me how you get down in the garden. Like, let me see what you're doing. And then all of a sudden their neck's like all over the place. And I think absolutely we have to understand the fundamentals and we have to know to look for it. We can't just let people just do sloppy stuff. And this girl, when she showed me her deadlift, it was not only was it not a deadlift, it was more of a squat, but it was, all over the place and inconsistencies between repetitions. And I was like, no, hold on. And I said, look, we've been working on this. You've been doing well. I'm going to teach you how basically to load this appropriately. And then I'm going to show you how you're supposed to do a deadlift. Here's how you set up. Here's what the bar path should look like. Here's what should be happening at the joints. And then I literally saw her the other day. And I won't say, I basically saw her and I was like, gave her pretty much a friggin' high five. I was like, that looks so nice. I was like, I went over to her and I was like, that looks perfect. How do you feel? And she's like, oh, I feel great. Like I haven't had any back pain, any leg pain, anything. And literally it's been like 2.5 weeks. It hasn't been that long, but it was just like, hey, let's get back into it. Look at the fundamentals. And that was key. So absolutely 100%.
Let me touch one more thing on that, because you just hit a good note there, and then I'll turn it over to you, Dwayne or Andrew. Consistency, right? Again, the fundamentals are just so assumed that we forget these little nuances add up. If you are looking for an adaptation, right, you have let's say you got the specific load down. Let's say you have the specific program down, right? You are just that. You have a specific number that you are repeating and accumulating on. But if one rep you're here and one rep you're here and one rep you're here, there's absolutely no consistency. You didn't biologically hone in a stressor. You constantly change the variable. And when it comes to mobility, like I don't even want to hear you tell me you're immobile. You haven't consistently squatted to depth to allow any sort of stretch, adaptation, consistent pattern. Like get out of here with your mobility crap if you're not even going to get the pattern down consistently for more than 3 repetitions. So that's a critical point you just brought up, consistency.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to touch on, I really liked what Andrew said about, do we really need a specific range of motion? So I wanted to stay there for just a second as we transition into a slightly different aspect of the conversation. I think a lot of what we've been talking about so far has dealt with, I guess, what we might call athletes or just generally athletic endeavors. And I'm wondering if anybody has any comments on mobility as it applies to the fact that generally Americans are living more sedentary lifestyles where we're working desk jobs, we're hunched over the computer, or we're hunched over our mobile devices, which, now we're starting to talk about shoulder mobility. We're talking about hip flexors and stuff like that from staying in a seated position for long periods of time. At what point do we need to be able to discuss with our clients or our loved ones or whomever mobility as it applies to like quality of life type stuff? At what point do we need to have those types of discussions?
I think day one. I mean, the second you see somebody, you need to ask them about what they do for a living. What does that entail? What does their day look like? I know in my job and all of us, we have the opportunity to get up and move throughout the day, but I can't tell you how many clients I see who have just developed some sort of tendinopathy or have some kind of persistent pain anytime they start a new activity because of those postural changes. And what this could be an upper or lower cross syndrome where we're having muscular changes. So then we're fighting that motor control because our muscles are used to working in one range of motion for 90% of the day. But then we also have issues like sciatic nerve mobility. Do we have hamstring length? Do we have any of those, especially with the majority of us sitting at a desk all day now in America and looking at a computer? So really addressing the impact that a 5 or 10 minute little routine every hour, every other hour at work can play a huge factor, but it also is a big education component. Look, you sit at work all day, you're a lawyer, you're doing depositions, you've got to sit there. It's not like you can get up and walk away. So before you get off work and you go to the gym and you instantly get on the stair climber and stairmaster because you want to get your heart going as fast as possible, what are you actually doing between walking from your desk to your car and then from your car to the gym and changing? What are you doing to prepare your body? So there's programs in kids, it's talked about a lot, especially with ACL specifically. They've developed programs for injury prevention. The FIFA, I think they call it 11 plus, so that's for soccer. Mm-hmm. But there's no reason we can't take that to the adult population where we say, hey, before you do anything, we need to take you through these specific exercises. And that could be hamstring stand-ups. That could be just general mobility, slowly working into a cardio program. If that's going from walking 5 to 10 minutes on a treadmill, as boring as that sounds for 90% of us, how do we actually change our body's perception as to what the day is? Because we talked about it a little bit last time, the biopsychosocial effect too. You've been sitting all day. Are you actually mentally and physically prepared to engage in a workout program? So how do we take that and incorporate these things so that they're at lower risk? I mean, how many times have we seen people get hurt at low reps or low weight, anything like that? And it's just, man, I went for a run. I wasn't doing much. And, I felt something. It felt okay. But 2 days later, I couldn't move. And a lot of those factors, I think, could be mitigated if we just got people moving beforehand and gave them that education of before you do anything, even if you're not working with me, because obviously nobody wants to pay us to work with us all day, every day. But even if you're not working with me, here's your routine. And it's a 15-minute or a 20-minute routine just to get the nerves firing, get the muscles moving, get you acclimated and get your mindset. And that way, it also gives them time to frame. What is going to be your RPE today? Am I going to move well today? And be able to really kind of learn their body for the day.
Which I think is really important. So when we talk, and I'll touch on that from an athletics standpoint, but I think, Dwayne, to answer your question on when do we talk about these things, I think we have to understand, and I think we all do, and I think we've kind of demonized exercise, and we've demonized, and even CrossFit in general, right? I mean, do I love every single principle that CrossFit does? Absolutely not. I think there's things that we could do better. Do I think that it's the worst thing in the world? Not necessarily. I think that, you see some people out there who are like, hey, and I actually saw this meme yesterday. And I was telling Andrew about it. It was like, oh, doctor of physical therapy who doesn't lift says, don't do kipping pull-ups because you'll hurt your shoulder. Doctor of physical therapy who does lift says, oh, it doesn't matter because mechanical shoulder pain isn't killing all of our population. And while that's a really polar view, like it's so extreme, it's like, okay, we're talking kipping pull-ups. Let's talk specificity. Like, does everyone need to be doing kipping pull-ups? I don't think so. I think it really depends on the individual, their goals. And then also I think, also on age and everything else to some degree. But I think we demonize these things so much when I think there are some positives. I think the positives of just exercise and moving in general and addressing it, like your person earlier who's like, I can't get into a front rack position, but letting them be confident and learn, even if you're like, I'm not crazy about the mobilizations, but maybe I teach her this because psychosocially she thinks I can't get into it because of mobility. So you're like, well, here, just try this one thing and then get into it. And she's like, oh, that feels great. Is it placebo? Is it actual neurophysiological effect? I mean, it depends. but I don't think it matters as long as this person gets moving. And I think we just need to encourage movement. And I agree with Andrew's statement of your body, it's Wolff's Law, right? Use it or lose it. If your body's used to being in a certain position for a long period of time, then certain muscles are going to lengthen, certain muscles are going to shorten. Prepare your body, or at least tell the body, hey, I don't want to be here all the time. Does it mean that it has to be a warm-up? Not necessarily, but it needs to at least be incorporated throughout the day, in my opinion. I think we're battling a much bigger issue. What we've seen in physical therapy is that low back pain hasn't changed in 20 years. The prevalence is the same. Neck pain, same. We haven't made a dent in this model that we use of when you're broken, come see me. And diabetes, diabetes is worse, right? Obesity, hit a pretty bad spike, and it's at least leveling off a little bit. But to say that it's not an issue anymore is ignorant. So I think if we can encourage mobility and just understand as coaches and as physical therapists, we need to take into account all these factors and be smart about it and ask these questions rather than just assuming, well, they have a desk job or they have this. Sometimes they're up a half the day. So I just think we need to do a better job of getting and encouraging movement, whether it's from a psychosocial standpoint and picking up on those flags and knowing that you can't be really mechanically, you can't really talk like, oh, you're doing this, that, and the other with that individual. Or if it's an athlete who wants to know like, hey, this, that, and the other. And if they think there's pinching in the hip and they're feeling it in the hip, and you saying, well, let's just titrate load, yada, 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 doesn't do it for them, maybe you do go in and say, well, let's take a look at mobility, not to just appease you, but let's take a look at it and figure it out and figure out what we need to do so you can get back to doing what you need to. But I think just population as a whole, man, we got to push it, push health and push lifting. And I think too many people are afraid of these settings, and I think we just have to do a better job. That's just me.
Right. Aaron, did you have any thoughts on just quality of life stuff as it pertains to mobility, sedentary lifestyle, anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, they essentially, just said the critical points. This isn't something that we can just do once and then the rest of the day we're fine. There's a lot of research coming out now about even those that quote unquote exercise, check the block, but if they're still completely sedentary the rest of their life, the comorbidities aren't too much better. It's more about daily physical activity as a whole, along with exercise. And I think that includes, like Andrew was saying, you can't just be a dead person for 8 hours and then transition into the gym and zone out and just go through the motions and not be engaged and not have your mind set on what you're about to do, because you are going to get hurt and your body is not adjusted to the environment. So I think it's critical to not be a vegetable the entire day from all aspects, from the big aspect of comorbidities and lifestyle to mobility to performance enhancement to the psychosocial and staying engaged.
Right. I think we touched on a lot. I think in this last topic it's been scattered throughout our discussion, but I just want to get everyone's opinion on this one thing: is what is the value of the specific mobility programs? So we mentioned ROMWOD, we mentioned Kelly Starrett's stuff. So what, if anything, is the value of training of those specific programs that target mobility as a separate discipline outside the context of whatever movement we're training as a primary focus?
Who's up?
I can kind of take it. So what I think is they're probably trying to hit the major groups that they have issues with, right? So the major things that you're probably going to see are issues with hip range of motion or motor control, issues with thoracic mobility, shoulder mobility, and then ankle dorsiflexion range of motion. So if you say, well, and I'm just speaking in general, so Aaron, if you're like, well, what about this one? Then let me know. I'm just kind of shooting from the hip here. I think if it's specific to those and they know that in general this is mostly what they see an issue with, so try these. Is it specific to the individual? No. But does it address the major issues that they may likely find? Sure. Because I think we could chime in on that all day, but I would say that, and I would agree with Aaron's earlier statement of half of the personal trainers out there and coaches out there have no idea what they're doing, and I think, and that sounds terrible, but I mean, when you really go in and you're like, let's look at a squat, let's look at a deadlift, and I say, well, what's the difference? And they're like, well, what do you mean? Well, this looks fine. They're deadlifting. It's from the floor. They're just lifting it from the floor. I'm like, yeah, but that's a squat. So I think they have to I think the programs are designed in such a way to address the major mobility limitations that they would encounter in a facility. Does that make it specific? No. But does it maybe at least address some people's concerns? Yeah, absolutely. Does that mean that every single person needs the mobilizations? No. I mean, for me, I know what I need because I've assessed myself and had other people assess me. So take into account, multiple injuries in the past, right? If I've had 3 ankle sprains on my left side, my ankle dorsiflexion is probably going to be a little bit more limited than on the right. I need to do something to manage that. And I probably have a short gastroc soleus complex on the left, comparatively speaking. So I think if we just treated everybody like they didn't have any injuries in the past or any past medical history, then I think we could say, oh, well, we don't really need those things. But I think they at least address the main impairments. I know the question was bigger than that, and I didn't touch on everything. Do I have a huge problem with all of it? Not necessarily. Do I think we could do better? Sure, but I think that takes us getting in and educating coaches individually so they can pick up on these things. I think people have been smart and they make money off of it. They're like, look, ankle dorsiflexion range of motion is going to be limited. And then, oh man, their hips may be a little bit limited. So why don't we just give that to them? And then when they feel better, we did a shotgun approach, but they got better. So, I mean, it's not specific, but go ahead.
I was going to say, to build on that, you mentioned how we need to train the coaches. And obviously, Ray and I work in different gyms. I work in a CrossFit specific gym, but we all work with different fitness athletes. And these programs are built for a class, right? So you're going in, teaching the teacher isn't going to change the class. Like, it might change his lecture, but where we need to come in, and one thing that we're doing at the gym is really kind of informing the client before they take the classes, because they need to know the difference between what is a stretch and what is discomfort, or versus where am I pushing it and where are my limitations. Ray said it. He knows his limitations. He knows where he's had his injuries and surgeries, things like that. 99% of coaches don't know anything about their patient's medical history or things like that. And so if we're not asking and we're not at least somewhat knowledgeable of what does a labrum issue look like, or, hey, this person's had a rotator cuff injury or things like that, that overhead squat stretching and what did I see last week? I saw clients all going into a circle and doing a squat and then taking the PVC bar overhead and having somebody else pull it backwards. That's all fine and dandy until you just go ahead and dislocate a shoulder, or
interior instability.
So that's great, but now you just caused a lot bigger issue than what they presented with before. So the classes are great. I hear rave reviews. Everybody loves them. I've taken them myself. I thought they were great in some aspect, but I don't know that it's the coaches that need as much training, at least as how to lead a class, as much as I think it is the coaches need to educate and work with the clients on identifying or giving the patient the education and the knowledge to say, hey, here's my limitations and here's what I need to watch out for based off of XYZ. And you're not going to know as a personal trainer or strength and conditioning coach necessarily what does it mean that this person has had a slap repair, or what does it mean that this person was born with some anterior hip condition where they just aren't going to move necessarily well through there. But what you can say is, hey, we know you've got this condition. I want you to go see a physical therapist, and having one that you trust, knows a little bit about the fitness components of it, can actually go in and do an exam. And if you can't educate them yourself, or you can't at least feel comfortable educating them yourself, pushing them to the person that can, so that they're safe in those classes. Because I think that's the dumbest thing that we do, is we put everybody in a group class of 20 people and we say, hey, this prescription fits everybody. And the classes are great. Ray said it earlier, we both follow a group that does awesome education online. But their big principle is mechanical shoulder pain is a lot better than diabetes or heart failure because you sit on your ass all day. It is, but take that 1 inch. Yeah, take that 1 inch of preventative medicine, so that they have the knowledge when they're going through the group classes to actually avoid issues.
Yeah. That's your dog again.
That's not me this time.
Yeah. No, it's
Sorry.
No, some dumbass outside driving his car.
I mean, I don't know what thoughts you have on that, Aaron. I mean, I think we may all come away agreeing on different points and disagreeing on other points just based off of personal experience. But what you got on that one, man?
Specifically to like ROMWOD and generalized mobilization programs, would be purely psychosocial, and it could be bad or good. Like, oh my God, I did do my ROMWOD today.
Yeah,
I'm going to get hurt. Bad side. Or this dude just will not chill out. He needs to do some, hey dude, go do ROMWOD. Do it. Like I'll be honest with you. My thoughts on ROMWOD are, meh. You want to do it? Cool. If you're going to freak out about not doing it, stay the hell away from it.
Yeah. I think it comes down to needing to understand the variables that patients present with. And I think that I think psychology majors pick up on this well. If you've ever taken a couple of psychology classes, we get a little bit of this in PT school. But I mean, I think we all can understand when someone comes in and they have high anxiety, they're probably not the person to take through a full exam and say, oh my God, your hip doesn't move well and your ankle doesn't move well. Because then now that person's like, well, hell, I can't even, if my ankle doesn't work well, my hip doesn't do this, then I've got to do this mobilization right before. And if I don't, then I'm going to hurt when I go to squat. And we all know if you think something's going to happen and you have a perception that something's going to happen or something's going to be bad for you, then that's actually more dangerous than the actual lift itself. And I think that's where we just have to take that into consideration. It's individual specific. Am I crazy about every single thing that it has in it? No. But I think we need to be a little bit more cautious of what we say to whom, and picking up on some of these factors as well when we start talking, oh, you don't have the mobility or you don't have this or that. So, man, guys, what I would love to do next time is maybe go joint specific, or not even joint specific, but maybe lift specific. Aaron, one of the things that you mentioned was like, oh man, if I do an overhead lift, I haven't done it in a while because I've tried to get my muscles positioned in such a way that, you know, I want them to be a little bit stronger in the positions I'm going to be lifting. So I just got to go and I take the bar and it's going to be uncomfortable and I'm going to do this, that, and the other. Aaron, what I would tell you is you're just a freak athlete and not everybody's built like you. So I'm going to have to agree to disagree with you on that. And that's where I think we could have a really fun conversation, because I think you can do that, but man, 90% of us cannot. And Andrew can speak to it, a lot of our population, it's like,
no doubt, and that's gonna come highly dependent on history and overall strength capabilities. Absolutely. And a lot of what's built underneath them. So no doubt, I'm not no disagreement there.
Well, and what I would say is, man, I'd love to do something lift specific, and maybe we break it down, and maybe we say, hey, in a squat, let's talk about what anteversion and retroversion is. How can you associate? Can you look at that as a coach, or should that be the physical therapist? Or what about forward trunk lean? And when is ankle dorsiflexion a problem, or whatever? And we can all come up. We can come in and you could say, well, maybe we do this, that, or the other. Andrew and I, from a physical therapy standpoint, could say, here's what we're seeing. Here's how we would assess it. And I think if we go lift specific, because this is kind of getting the general thoughts and everything out in the open, which I think is great. But yeah, I mean, I'd love to do something lift specific next time we come in. if any, or unless somebody has any protest to that and wants to do something else, I don't care.
No, let's keep running with it. Let's talk about this all too famous and overglorified freaking overhead squat everyone's hyped up about.
Hey, Tim, I mean, I'd love to see your thoughts on it. We'll come in with ours. I guess we can just address it from a mobility or we'll figure it out. We'll go as we go, but I think that'd be really cool when it kind of hit next. But I appreciate the talk, appreciate the conversation. I mean, I know we ran definitely a little long, but and I got to go make cookies with my kid. But
Eric's got to go to bed.
Yeah, that's it, man. That's it.
It's tough.
So,
hey, well, I appreciate it, guys. Thanks for having me in.
Yeah,
man.
of course.
Yeah, definitely.
We'll plan for sometime next week. We'll just kind of text and figure it out. So, all right, guys, y'all take care.
All right.
Sounds good.
See y'all.